Story recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a drama, sci-fi film called AI Artificial Intelligence. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. In the 22nd century, global warming causes a staggering rise in sea levels, wiping out coastal cities worldwide. Millions are displaced, and the erratic climate causes famine worldwide. The few surviving and prospering governments implement licensing pregnancy to minimize overpopulation. To compensate for the world's need for manpower, robots or mecha are created. As mechas do not require as many resources to survive as humans do, they become necessary in society. Artificial intelligence inventor Professor Alan Hobby demonstrates the progress of a mecha's intelligence, how it's programmed to react to damage or pain and to remember to avoid the cause of damage, much like a human would. But this does not mimic a human's emotion, which brings Professor Hobby to the next phase of his project, a robot child programmed to love its parents, among other complex emotions. The mecha child will be marketed to couples who yearn for a child but cannot obtain the license to reproduce. 20 months after the presentation, married couple Henry and Monica Swinton visit their son, Martin, in the hospital. After contracting a rare disease, Martin was placed under suspended animation until a cure is found. Martin's doctor, Dr. Fraser, worries for Monica, who still hopes that Martin will recover. He advises Henry to help Monica cope with her grief, as she's currently suppressing it under false hope. Hoping that this will help Monica move on, Henry applies to Cybertronics beta testing and gets handpicked by Professor Hobby to test their latest invention, David. David is a prototype mecha child programmed to experience love. Horrified and offended, Monica argues to Henry, thinking that he's trying to replace Martin with a mecha. But upon realizing that she needs to fill a hole in her heart, Monica entertains the idea of being able to take care of a child again, even if it's a mecha. Getting her on board with the idea, Henry explains how the imprinting protocol works. Once they decide to keep David, they can choose to activate his imprinting, making David loyal to them, akin to loving a parent. The imprinting is irreversible. Therefore, if the couple decides to return David, he will be scrapped. He presses the importance that they shouldn't imprint until they are sure. That evening, Monica and Henry allow David into Martin's old room. David is eager to please his parents, but remembering that he's not real makes Monica uncomfortable, shutting the door on him when he asks to be dressed by her. In the morning, David watches Monica prepare breakfast curiously. Monica tries to ignore him for the rest of the day, but David continues to watch her around the house. Frustrated, Monica puts him away in the closet. Minutes later, Monica feels guilty and opens the closet for David. She excuses that they're playing hide and seek before sending him to his room to play alone. At dinner, David watches the couple eat, fascinated at their actions. The child pretends to drink from an empty glass to mimic Henry, then copies Monica as she eats pasta. When noodles get stuck out over Monica's lips, David lets out a loud laugh that startles the two. The sudden outburst has the parents laughing along, finally experiencing the joy of having a child again. That evening, Monica preps David for bed, carefully tending to him as she would to her real son. She looks at him lovingly but remembers Martin in the hospital. A tear falls down her cheek, conflicted between grief and guilt. The following morning, Monica performs the imprinting protocol, accepting that she needs David to cope with Martin's condition. Her voice cracks as she says the code to trigger David's love for her. As she finishes, David's face changes from an innocent smile to wonderment. For the first time, David calls Monica mommy. Hearing this, Monica grows attached to David. One night, Monica is giddy as she prepares to attend an event with Henry. Heading down the stairs, Henry worries about Monica's affection for David, reminding her that he's a mecha, but Monica sees David as a gift. David comes down the stairs to see them off, but the parents realize that he has used up Monica's expensive perfume. While Monica looks solemnly at the empty perfume bottle, she confirms to David that she will die eventually, leaving him alone. Not wanting David to feel alone, Monica takes an old robotic bear that used to be Martin's. Monica gives the bear, Teddy, to David to keep him company while they're away. One morning, David shows Monica that he can relay the audio from her telephone, turning himself into a speaker. On the other end of the line, Henry demands for Monica, not hearing her due to David's speaker mode. David finally hands over the phone, where Monica receives urgent news. After a few days, Monica introduces David to Martin, who has woken up from his suspended sleep, cured of his rare disease. As the days go by, Martin treats David like a toy, asking him to perform things and questioning how he was made. When asked for the first thing he remembers, David draws a bird with feathers sticking out of the tail. One afternoon, Martin requests for Monica to read Pinocchio to him and David, secretly hoping to taunt David with the story. Instead, David is fascinated by the idea of a puppet turning into a real boy. During lunch, Martin teases David into an eating contest. Monica and Henry panic, knowing that the act could break David, but the boys don't listen to their warnings. Finally, David stops as one side of his face droops, frightening the family. David is taken for repairs while Monica holds his hand. Jealous of how his mother worries for David, Martin tricks David into secretly cutting Monica's hair while she's asleep, telling him that she will love him if he does so. Despite David's objection, Martin manipulates him until he agrees. David goes into the parents' bedroom to cut Monica's hair with a scissor. But Monica turns, nearly getting scratched by the blades. Henry shakes David angrily, demanding why he did it until Monica stops him. While setting up Martin's birthday party, Henry desperately convinces Monica that David is no longer worth the risk. Monica defends David, still seeing him as a child that makes mistakes. At the pool party, Martin's friends taunt David and use a knife to test him. This triggers David's defense programming, making him hug Martin, the only human he feels safe with, while backing away from the other boys. But David backs away too far and drags Martin to the bottom of the pool. The adults pry Martin off of David's arms and resuscitate him. David watches from the bottom of the pool as the adults take Martin away, leaving him alone. Because of the event, Monica becomes wary of David. Monica sees David's letters to her, further complicating her feelings towards him. But she has no choice. Monica tells David that they go on a trip with Teddy the next day. David is overjoyed at the idea of spending time with his mother. On the following day, Monica is in tears as she drives to Cybertronics to have David be destroyed. Overcome with guilt, she diverts the car into the woods, where David happily sets up a picnic mat for them. Monica stops him, revealing that she has to leave him for good. Finally processing her words, David begs and apologizes for everything he'd done. He asks if he can come home after becoming a real boy like Pinocchio, but those stories are not real. Before leaving, Monica gives David some money and tells him not to be caught by Cybertronics and other people. When David doesn't let her go, Monica shoves him, startling herself and then the boy. Monica apologizes before driving away. David watches the car as it leaves. In Rouge City, a mecha named Joe comforts his client before spending an intimate night with her. After the act, Joe happily skips through town as he makes his way to his next client. The hotel owner advises Joe to show his operating license badge as the Flesh Fair is hunting for stray mechas in town. Joe changes his hair to blonde before entering the room where his client waits. He sits next to her but finds the bed wet with blood. Another man appears in the room, revealing himself as the one who killed the woman. Realizing that he's been set up, Joe hides in an alley and removes his operating license badge so he can't be traced. Out in the woods, David tells Teddy that he wants the blue fairy from the Pinocchio story to turn him into a real boy. They stop when a truck dumps scrap parts that abandoned mechas surge through to repair themselves. Joe walks into the scene with a moon-like aircraft appearing behind him. The mechas run in fear as the Flesh Fair hunts them down. The group finds Joe among the crowd, interested in getting an unlicensed new model mecha for their show. Motorists chase after David and other mechas into a derelict town, firing magnetic discs to trap them. David follows some mechas into an abandoned cottage and meets a nanny mecha, who offers to care for him. The motorists find and take them, along with Joe. While they're hoisted up, David tries to hold on to Teddy, but he falls. Branches break Teddy's fall, allowing him to land safely and chase after David. At the Flesh Fair, Teddy is picked up and taken to the Lost and Found. Outside, the crowd cheers as old and abandoned mechas are destroyed. Afraid, David holds on to Joe's hand, who's surprised at the boy's touch. Teddy escapes the Lost and Found, finding David in a cage. A little girl picks up Teddy and sees David, thinking that he's a real boy. The little girl approaches her father, who's one of the programmers of the show. The father is alarmed upon hearing that a boy is among the mechas. Back at the cage, David learns from the other mechas that the humans are cutting them down to maintain superiority. The girl's father approaches David and uses a portable X-ray to make sure that David is a mecha. The father is startled, fascinated by David, but the showrunner is not amused. While the two men talk, David watches the nanny mecha get doused in acid as part of a game. The showrunner insists on putting David on the show, despite the girl's father's claims that he's too valuable to destroy. The showrunner takes David, who grabs hold of Joe's hand for safety. David and Joe are dragged into the field and into the acid trap. The showrunner presents David to the crowd, ranting about how the mecha child insults the human population. But the crowd turns silent, conflicted upon seeing a child on stage. When acid falls onto David's shoulders, he screams in fear. Hearing his cries, the crowd is convinced that David is a real child, horrified that the show will harm him. The crowd turns on the showrunner, throwing at him instead of David. The others free David just before the crowd riots, allowing David and Joe to leave the fair safely. In Professor Hobby's office, various photos of David growing up reveal that he's designed from Professor Hobby's late son. The team reports that David was spotted at the Flesh Fair, assuring the professor that he escaped safely. While walking in the woods, David and Teddy freeze upon seeing the moon, thinking that it's the Flesh Fair's aircraft. They take a different route just in case. When Joe learns about David's quest to find the Blue Fairy, he tells him that most women can be found in Rouge City. Joe and David plan to head to Rouge City to ask Dr. No about the Blue Fairy. To give them a ride to Rouge City, Joe tempts a group of teenagers to meet mecha women. Once there, Joe gives David a tour of the neon-filled city. Fascinated by a statue of an angel, David approaches a church, thinking that the angel is the Blue Fairy. Joe takes him instead to Dr. No, a program that serves as an all-knowing encyclopedia. Using the money Monica gave him, David learns from Dr. No that the blue fairy is at the end of the world, quoting a passage by Professor Hobby. Joe is troubled, knowing that mechas who go to the end of the world never come back. Joe tries to convince David that humans hate them, but David insists that Monica will love him if he's a real boy. But according to Joe, a human can never love a mecha. Upon leaving Dr. No's store, police take away Joe, believing that he ended the life of his previous client. Curious, David hops into the helicopter's driver's seat and powers it on. His reckless driving causes chaos that allows Joe to escape. Joe jumps inside the helicopter, driving the vehicle for David. With Joe driving the helicopter, they reach the wasteland that was previously Manhattan. After the sea level rose exponentially, the city is left in ruins and underwater. David finds lion statues with water pouring out of their mouths, remembering Dr. No's message about the crying lions. Setting down the helicopter in the building next to the lions, David and Joe search for Professor Hobby. Full of hope, David enters an office and approaches a chair that's turned away. But instead of Professor Hobby, David finds a child who looks exactly like him. The other David smiles at him and invites him to read with him. Thinking that this other David will replace him, David smashes a lamp against the table in the other David's head, revealing that it's also a mecha. Joe leaves out of fear as David lashes out, screaming that he's special and unique until Professor Hobby stops him. The kind professor assures David that he's a real boy, claiming that he is his blue fairy. Dr. No's clues on finding the blue fairy were explicitly made to lead David to Professor Hobby. The journey also tested David's emotions and how his motivation will lead him to chase an unknown dream, which other mechas cannot do. Professor Hobby walks out of the office to gather his team, leaving David pondering about his journey being part of someone else's design. David enters the other room, finding several mechas that look like him. He approaches a window and sees the bird he remembers as his first memory, a statue outside the office. Several boxes are laid out as David, and his female counterpart, Arlene, are mass-produced to be sold. Realizing that he was never unique, David heads outside and drops into the water as Joe watches from the helicopter. Underwater, a school of fishes carries David until he falls in front of something that catches his attention. He reaches out, but Joe finds him and pulls him away using the helicopter's extended arm. Once above water, David reveals that he found the blue fairy underwater. Before they can go further, Joe is magnetized by a police helicopter hovering above them. Joe says goodbye to David, asking him to tell his story to the ladies once he's grown up as a real boy. Joe activates the helicopter's submarine mode before floating away. Driven to find the blue fairy, David navigates the helicopter-turned submarine into an abandoned carnival with Teddy beside him. His impaired driving causes him to trip some wires that loosen the Ferris wheel. Just as David finds the blue fairy statue, the Ferris wheel collapses on top of the helicopter, trapping them. David's eyes focus on the blue fairy, unconcerned that they are trapped. David pleads for the blue fairy to turn him into a real boy as the years go by. Even when the lights in the vehicle die down and the sea creatures perish, the blue fairy stands still, smiling as David's glimmer of hope. 2,000 years later, the world is enveloped in ice and snow. The humans have long gone. An alien spacecraft tours the city of Manhattan as they colonize the planet. There, they retrieve David's helicopter, finding the boy and Teddy in the ice. Once reactivated, David convulses before spotting the blue fairy in front of him. He slides out of the helicopter and approaches the frozen statue as the alien creatures watch him. David touches the blue fairy, causing it to crack and break in front of him. Only then does the spell break, and David notices his surroundings. Knowing that he lived with humans, the aliens scan David's memory to understand him and the planet better. When David comes to, he's sitting at the dining table in Monica's house. The home is just like how he remembers it. David eagerly searches for Monica, announcing that he's home. Instead, a different voice calls his name. David finds the blue fairy, now alive and talking. David asks her to turn him into a real boy, but she admits that she cannot do so. The aliens use the blue fairy to speak to David, informing him that Monica is long gone. David mourns, learning that the blue fairy cannot bring Monica back either, as all organic parts of her are long gone as well. Teddy approaches the two, reminding David of the time he cut Monica's hair. Teddy reveals that he kept the lock of hair that David cut from Monica. Now, the aliens can bring back his mother. In his old bedroom, David fondly remembers Joe while Teddy repairs himself. They see a figure at the door, thinking that it's Monica. Instead, it's one of the aliens who conveys its fascination with human beings. The aliens wish to bring back the humans, using organic traces to clone them. But it remains imperfect, as the clones only live for one day. This means that if they bring Monica back, it will only be for one day. David holds on to hope that Monica will be special like him, that she will last forever just like he did after being trapped in the helicopter. Choosing to have his mother even just for a day, David heads to her bedroom and finds Monica in bed. He gazes at her fondly, brushing hair from her face as tears stream down David's cheeks. When Monica wakes up, she greets him with a warm smile. For this one day, David and Monica spend time together. David happily shows Monica paintings of his journey, plays hide and seek with her and Teddy, and celebrates his birthday. When the lights outside grow dim, David tucks Monica to bed, worried that she will not wake up after. Hearing her say that she loved him, David smiles in both grief and joy. Feeling content, David decides to sleep next to his beloved mother, reaching his dreams for the first time in his life. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.